Good evening, everyone. All right. So we are with this topic of dealing with longer, tougher, longer, tougher passages in RC or critical reasoning. Now, it's interesting that we are doing this now so close to the exam because this is usually one of the very first classes that I do on RCs. Uh, but I think it's also exactly the right time to refocus our attention on this. Right now, you are also caught up in solving mock after mock, trying to memorize every current affairs tidbit and getting buried under technicalities of reasoning. That some people are seeing their scores either plateau or even dropping. Uh, so it's important to pause for a moment and refocus on the most substantial and the most fundamental part of the entire paper, which is reading passages. So I'm going to show you, or rather, we will, as I said, we will refocus our attention on how to go about reading these passages efficiently, right? And reading some of the tough RC passages very calmly and confidently. So let's start with as to uh, why are some of these passages tough, right? So you have to understand the passages themselves are not. Not the case that passages are difficult because you lack skill, right? They are difficult by design. You will find why will you find a RC passage tough, or when in which situations do you find RC passages tough? So you have long, winding sentences, some idea that you have not come across earlier in life, right? You see this idea as some abstract idea with no real world anchor would mean I can't sort of relate this to something I know. So that passage becomes tough for me, right? Or sometimes it is filled up with these, you know, technical vocabulary of a specific domain, right? Or sometimes there is a multiplicity of viewpoints in the passage, and it becomes slightly tricky to figure which one of them is the author's position, right? So these are the circumstances in which we find these passages tough, right? So let's see how do I approach a tough passage. uh the first step is, and it's almost like a cliche now, don't get bogged down, right? I'm reading the first few statements of the passage. I find this, you know the idea itself is something very new to me. The language is so complicated, right? And my mind is telling me to go somewhere else, right? So it's resisting. So my thing is, if you if you come across a passage and you find first few lines of the passage tough, it's very important for you to have that positive frame of mind when you're approaching the passage, any passage, right? Because you understand, when you are in a mock situation and you find one passage tough and you leave it and go on to the next passage, it keeps playing on in your head, right? Even while you are reading the second passage, it plays on your mind as to you have left one passage, right? So that may drive up the anxiety and slow you down while you're reading the next passage. So the idea is, we have 120 questions in the paper, and you can easily imagine that somebody who's aiming a tier 1 college, right? They will be attempting almost all questions on the passage, or almost all questions in the paper. Essentially, they will be attempting almost all passages, right? So, so just be there with a mindset that you have to do this passage, right? So don't panic, right? Uh, Approach this difficult passage with curiosity as you would any other passage, right? Be curious to understand what is that the author wants to tell me. The language may be difficult, the sentences may be long winding, but then this passage was meant to be read by somebody like me. This passage, in most cases is not meant for some expert or some scholar. This passage was meant to be for an arm reader like me, right? So the author is trying to convey an idea, and the author has written such a long passage, right? It's only fair that I go through this passage and understand what the author is trying to tell me, right? I tell people, right, when you are reading a tough passage, remember the author's intention is not to make it tough for you. On the contrary, the author's intention is to, in a way, uh, you know, if there is an argument in the passage, the author's intention is to get you on their side, right? They're trying to convince you. They'll not make it extremely difficult for you to process it or comprehend it. So the author is extending a hand of friendship towards you, trying to convince you of a certain viewpoint. So it's only fair that I read this passage with curiosity and try to understand that point, right? So there's this slight psychological shift, this switch that I have to make in reading a tough passage. Read it with curiosity, right? So yeah, so the question, the thing, the approach should be not this looks too difficult, but let me understand what the author is trying to say, right? Go with that attitude. That attitudinal sort of change is very important in dealing with a tough passage. Okay. So the next point, right? Now we are into the practicality of it. How do I do it? Okay, so that was the attitudinal sort of psychological uh, switch. Now, how do I go about it practically? So it says start strong. What do I mean by that? So when you are, into a passage, tough or easy, read the first two statements with a lot of attention, right? And you may have realized in the first two statements, usually there is a very important idea. Now imagine yourself in the shoes of the author and you are about to write an essay. How will you, doesn't or don't you sort of spend a lot of time into thinking how to start my essay? So the author also undergoes the same process. He may have put in a lot of thought on how to start the passage, right? So those first two statements of the passage, right, they're very, very important. So they either tell you the context, the background, probably, in which the author's argument is set, right? Or they tell you some problem. And we have seen in many passages, the first few lines, in starting of the passage, we are made aware of a certain problem. The problem is introduced right in the beginning, and that becomes important, right? Or the author's own viewpoint. In many passages we have seen, especially in the logical reasoning passages, we have seen the author starts the passage by stating their position. It's like a thesis statement, right? You start with your position. Imagine yourself to be in a debating competition. You're trying to present an argument. So usually you start by stating your position and then you add the supporting evidence or details. So if the first statement of the passage is the author's viewpoint, is the author's position, becomes very, very important, right? So whichever be the case, either it is setting up a context, background, or is it defining a problem, stating a problem, or is the author presenting his viewpoint? In either of these cases, the first two statements, very important. Read them with a lot of attention. Don't rush through them. Okay. So you have a better grip. Once you get the first two statements of the passage, you will realize you have a better grip of where the author is headed. You have a better grip on the direction in which the passage is headed. Also, it keeps you focused, right? You are reading the first two statements with a lot of attention, and now from there on, interest and curiosity starts building up, right? So the first two statements, read them with full attention. If need be, reread them. So for example, you are reading the first two, you're starting a passage and it does not immediately register, reread that first two statements. Okay. So, right. So this is again, it's almost like a cliche now. When you are reading the passage, you're reading for the main idea. Okay. Don't get caught up in dense data, technical details. So I'm not saying that you don't have to read them. Read them through, but focus on why this particular detail is there, why this example is there, why all this data, right? Increase in GDP, unemployment going up, foreign exchange going down, imports going up, and increase in taxes and whatnot. So many numbers are thrown at you, so much data is thrown at you. To what purpose? What is the author trying to do here? Is he explaining something? Is he criticizing something, maybe slow economic growth? Or is he proposing something through this data? Okay, so I'm reading through the data, I'm not breaking my head on it, right? But then every time I'm going through the data, in my head, I'm constantly figuring as to what purpose this data or this example or this detail serve, right? So keep figuring these three. One, what is the author trying to do? Explain, pointing out a problem, or proposing something. How does this paragraph connect to the previous one? I've read paragraph 1, some problem was discussed. Paragraph 2, likely solutions are being discussed. So I understand how does it connect to paragraph 1. Paragraph 1 में problem बताया, paragraph 2 में कुछ solutions दिए, and maybe paragraph 3 में author's own sort of proposal comes in, right? So I'm sort of building that structure in my head. So how does this paragraph connect to the previous one? Where is this headed? Where is the passage headed? Right? So don't get bogged down. Don't obsess over details. Don't try to master details. Just try to understand why that detail is there. All right, everyone. Okay. Now, red flags and green flags, right? So words like however, but, yet, and in so many passages, right? We have done so many passages with I've done these passages with almost all students at CLAT possible. In so many of these passages in the mocks, we have seen words like however, but, yet introduce a very important point in the passage. So what do I do when I come across words like however, but, yet, or something like critics argue, critics claim, or something like ironically, right? I slow down my pace and I read those lines very, very, very carefully. In many cases, after however or but comes in a very substantial point of the passage. And but there are some things that I can quickly read. Okay. something like names of people. I don't need to master that in my head. How do I pronounce this name? Or any proper noun, name of a virus, name of a plant species. I don't need to sort of break my head into understanding what the pronunciation would be, right? So I'm going through this rather quickly, names of the people, long list, technical, a lot of technical terms. What I'm doing, come across lot many technical terms, technical details, jargony detail. I just try to understand what is the point the author wants to make through these technical details, right? Overly detailed descriptions, historical timelines. I'm going over them very quickly and pausing at however or critics argue or despite or although or ironically. I'm just pausing there to understand that key idea. All right. Pivot words, we have briefly discussed them. Pivot words are same words as however, but, right? So slow down at pivots uh, because they signal a change. Uh, how it happens is the author presents a viewpoint. However, the author contests it. What becomes more important, somebody else's viewpoint or the authors in this case who contest that viewpoint? The authors, obviously, right? So, however, or sometimes after, although there's some background info, but after the comma, a more substantial point is made. So, as we said earlier in the previous slide, we just pause or, we just slow down on these words. Uh, And then, very important, whenever I come across the author's viewpoint, right? Again, I underline that in the passage. So avoid underlining a lot many statements. So, for example, especially when we start out, right, we tend to underline the entire passage. Then underlining would lose its purpose, right? I'm underlining some strategic parts of the passage so that it becomes easier for me to scan and skim when I'm answering the questions, right? So in my case, what I tend to do is I underline those statements that come after the pivot words, however, yeah, yet, but, or those statements in which I think the author is expressing their opinion. Words like this must be done, the government must implement this policy, the government should do this, the panel should look into this, all these statements, right? Or statements like, sometimes the opinion is expressed in a very subtle way. And you have come across words like the author calling something questionable. Author's opinion? Yes. Author calling something unwarranted. Author's opinion? Yes. Inadequate, premature, or promising. This looks promising. Author's opinion. Or the author's opinion could be more explicit, more strongly worded. Something like the model is flawed, the approach is discriminatory, right? So they could be such explicit statements as the author's opinion statements, or they could be more subtle, like calling something questionable or promising. But yes, I come across the author's opinion, I underline that part. It will help me. Opinion statements and pivot word statements, they sort of become the anchor statements for me in that particular paragraph, right? So what we'll do is this is a passage that I do very often in the classes, but this is a classical passage to understand how to spot the author's viewpoint and also how to sort of navigate a paragraph, a tough paragraph, using pivot words. So I'll give you some time, and if you could just read this, and then we'll solve this together. All right, so let's do this together, everyone. Uh, it says 19th century liberals recognized that democracy comes in various forms and dreaded the version advocated by Rousseau, right? So in the first line, right, it does not look like a viewpoint line. It looks more of a context line. Context, by context, I mean background info line. This is what the 19th century liberals, understood of democracy, that it comes in various forms, but they dreaded the version advocated by somebody called Rougeau. And what was that version? Inspired lawgiver interprets and implements the will of the people. So this is what Rougeau. So I'll just write R to show that this is R's or Rougeau's viewpoint, right? Nowadays, such fears are dismissed as elitist, but so pivot word, right? But the old fashioned liberals, referring to 19th century liberals. Old fashioned liberals grasped a vital truth, and the author is calling it vital truth. So, this is something which I said earlier, right? That this is something, one second, I'll write it. Right. So, this is something where subtly the author's opinion gets expressed, right? Subtle expression of opinion. These liberals grasped a vital truth. What is that vital truth? Popular government has no necessary connection with the freedom of individuals or minorities. Now, when the author is calling this to be a vital truth, I'll just change the color of my pen to green because this becomes an important line for me. And see how it comes after this pivot word, but. Now, the author is saying they grasped a vital truth, and that truth becomes important for me because the author believes in this truth. If the author is calling some statement as vital truth, the author believes in it, right? What is that truth? Popular government has no necessary connection with the freedom of individuals or minorities. All right. Of course, liberals today will say this can be remedied by installing the rule of constitutional rights. Who are these people? Liberals today. So, again, there is a viewpoint expressed not of the author, somebody else's. किसका viewpoint है? Liberals का. Liberals today का. Contemporary liberals. So, what I'll do is I identify this statement once again as viewpoint of liberals of today. I will write LT. So we have a view of Rougeau, we have a view of 19th century liberals, and we have a view of liberals of today, right? So far, the author has only expressed a subtle, in a very subtle way, an opinion, right? But the author has not really stated their position. Okay, but let's read further. Such systems are fragile, however. Just look at this pivot word. तो बट के बाद एक व्यू पॉइंट एक्सप्रेस हुआ था in a subtle way, author's viewpoint. And then this line, which contains a pivot word, however, वहां पर author का view express हो रहा है. Do we recognize this statement? Again, I'll change the color of the ink to green. Do we recognize this statement? Such systems are fragile and count for nothing when large sections of society are indifferent or actively hostile to liberal values. Yes, this is the author's voice. So I will write VP. VP is author's viewpoint. Thereafter, the author says, where this is the case, democracy means nothing more than the tyranny of the majority. Again, VP, right? So the author's opinion gets expressed in the last two statements of the passage. We have a viewpoint of liberals, contemporary liberals. We have a viewpoint of erstwhile liberals, 19th century liberals. We have a view of Rougeau, right? Amidst this, there is an author's viewpoint also. Now, when there is a question asking you the main idea or main point, whose viewpoint is of critical essence? The authors, right? So we are looking for an option here. We are looking for an option that goes along with the author's view expressed in the last two lines, right? Now it becomes easy for me to eliminate options, right? Option A, inspired lawgivers in liberal democracies are better equipped to interpret and implement the will of the people than in illiberal democracies. Does the author hold this view that inspired lawgivers are better equipped to interpret and implement the will of the people? This is not the author's view. This is completely, you know, it's no such view is expressed in the passage, by the way. Neither can it be inferred. Especially, this is not the author's view. So we can easily eliminate this. I'll just put it in red. B, 19th century liberals believed that democracy means nothing more than the tyranny of the majority. ये 19th century liberals ने बोला था? No. This is what the author sort of implies or states towards the end of the passage, with some qualification, with some condition, right? But this is not what the 19th century liberals said. And if I'm sort of looking for a main idea option, actually, I'm more concerned with what the author believes. So any option that starts with such phrasing that the liberals believe this won't be the main idea, right? We are primarily looking for a statement that states the author's view, not what somebody else believed. But again, 19th century, the other problem with the option is the 19th century liberals did not believe in this. They were not saying that, they were saying something else. So B is out. C, constitutional rights are fragile and ineffective in ensuring protection of the freedom of individuals in any democracy. Now, the author said something like this, right? So C is some option that I'm not able to immediately eliminate. It does not look immediately bad. So I'll keep this and also look at D. So every time I'm doing a main idea question, inference question, right? I am not just, if I see a good option, I don't mark it and move on. I try to eliminate the bad options out. So I'm reading all the options. So let's look at D. Popular governments in illiberal democracies use the power of the majority to clamp down on the freedom of minorities. Now, this too looks very good, right? It aligns with the author's view presented in the last two statements. So C and D come very close, right? So when the two options come very close, what do? I take out a magnifying glass, right? There's no space to draw a magnifying glass, but I take out a magnifying glass and start looking at the two options very, very carefully, word by word. So when I was doing that for option C, constitutional rights are fragile and ineffective in ensuring protection of the freedom of individuals, it looked very good until I read in any democracy. So did the author mean that it's true in all democracies? No. It's true in those democracies where large sections of society are indifferent or actively hostile to liberal values. And just read the last line very carefully. Where this is the case, in such circumstances, there is a condition when large sections are illiberal, then democracy is nothing more than the tyranny of the majority. So in any democracy makes that statement option exaggerated, extreme, it is out. and D is the correct answer then. So let me tell you, this is, and I have done this passage with so many batches, so many students, right? And I can tell you that not many, right? In fact, majority of the class batch gets this incorrect, because this is a difficult, this is a difficult passage, right? The author's view, right? There are so many viewpoints expressed of so many different groupings, so many different individuals, that the author's view, gets lost amidst all that. But remember, when you are doing a difficult passage, it's extremely important that you are able to spot the author's view, right? And that will help you eliminate choices and arrive at the correct one. In many cases, the author's view comes after these important words like however, but, ironically, right? So we pause there when I'm reading. Pause, not pause, but slow down the speed when I come across such words. All right. So this was one exercise, right? We were doing it on a smaller passage. But let's see if you can apply all of this on a bigger passage, right? So, this will sort of require some amount of patience on your side, right? Because it becomes a little difficult reading it from the screen, right? But let's see, right? Whatever I've discussed so far, can we all can it all come together on a bigger passage? Can we apply this on a bigger passage and see if it works, right? Before we do that, bigger passage, I'll just clear the screen and we can just go through what we discussed once more, right? I'll just do a quick recap. So don't get bogged down, read with intent, right? Keep figuring what the author is getting at, right? Remember, the author is your friend, extending a hand of friendship, right? And he's trying to take you on his side, okay? Start strong, read the first two statements with utmost attention, right? They are the anchor statements for us in the passage. Read for the main idea. Don't obsess over technical details, right? Jargony language. Just try and understand why this detail is, why that particular detail or jargon or whatever example is there in the passage. What is the point that the author is driving home? Three important questions. What is the author trying to do? How does this paragraph connect to the previous one? Where is this headed? Slow down on these words, the red words, the red flags, and we can go through the green flags rather quickly. Pivot words, important words. Underline the author's viewpoint. The last slide wherein, as in the last point, underline the author's viewpoint may not be sort of applicable in a screen reading. But yeah, just hold on to that. Just register that viewpoint. Okay. So what I'll do is stop sharing this and bring up a passage, a longer passage for you guys. Okay. I hope it's appropriately visible. Just give me a second. So what I'll do is I'll zoom in on the first paragraph. Okay. And also, by the end of it, when we reach when we are done with the session, I'll put this in the link, in the description link, right? I'll post the link to the passage, because we may not be able to do all the questions on this passage, but that link and all the questions will be there for you to solve it at a later stage. But currently we are reading this passage, right, starting from the first paragraph, right? So I'll give you some time to read the first paragraph. All right. So the first paragraph of this passage sets up the passage beautifully, right? After having read the first paragraph, it becomes sort of amply clear that what the rest of the passage will be about. Yes or no? So let's look at it, okay? Uh, let's read the first paragraph together, and then we can go on to read the second and the third paragraph. Okay, we'll do it paragraph by paragraph. So, governments of developing countries occasionally enter into economic development agreements with foreign investors who provide capital and technological expertise that may not be readily available in such countries, right? So, we do not see this statement as a viewpoint statement or a problem statement. We understand this to be a context setting statement, right? Besides the normal economic risk that accompanies such enterprises. So enterprises are looking to invest in these developing countries. So there is some risk in every business, right? So besides the normal economic risk that accompanies such enterprises, investors face the additional risk that the host government may attempt unilaterally to change in its favor the terms of agreement or even to terminate the agreement altogether and appropriate the project for itself. So that the government, right? The government can unilaterally just terminate the agreement. It has entered into an agreement with the corporate, a foreign company, let's say, and it can unilaterally change the terms of the agreement or terminate the agreement, right? At the expense of the corporate. Now, in order to make, so now maybe the next line we are saying this shows a potential problem here, right? The next line, that there is some problem. In order to make economic development agreements more attractive to investors, some developing countries have attempted to strengthen the security of such agreements. So they have attempted to strengthen the security in the sense that it restricts their power to unilaterally terminate the agreement or change the terms of the agreement, right? So, how? By specifying that the agreements will be governed by general principles of law recognized by civilized nations. So maybe these governments, what they are trying to attempting to do is they are giving reassurance, some reassurance to the corporates. Okay, whatever the agreement is, it will be governed by general principles of law recognized by civilized nations. So maybe they have less power to unilaterally sort of terminate the agreement, right? To add that security. Now comes the pivot word. However, right? Now, after however, here, it's not the author's opinion that comes, it's what advocates of government's freedom want to say. So, who will be the advocates of government's freedom? Those who are in favor of government having complete freedom, let's say, to alter the contracts, to terminate the contracts, right? So these advocates, what they are saying is that such agreements argue that these agreements fall within a special case of contracts known as administrative contracts, a concept that originated in French law. They assert, and this is what the advocates are asserting, that under the theory of administrative contracts, a government retains inherent power to modify or terminate its own contract. And this power indeed constitutes a general principle of law. Just look, how does it go back to this general principles said earlier in the paragraph? The author said, right, that some of these developing countries are saying, okay, boss, don't worry, we, whatever agreements we sign, it will be governed by general principles of law, right? So you need not worry. They are saying this to the corporates. But now the advocates of government's freedom are saying, by those general laws, by those general principles, the government has inherent power to terminate any contract. So, in a sense, these advocates are saying the government will always have that power, a built in power, to terminate the contract anytime they want. This important point came after, however, but a more important point comes after this pivot word, however. And maybe I sort of use a different thing to highlight that. However, their argument is flawed on at least two counts. Whose argument? Argument of advocates of government's freedom. Right. Now, this is the context, right? We understand this is something related to the contracts between developing countries and the corporates who want to invest in those economies, right? So what some of these governments are saying, okay, whatever contracts we are signing, they will be governed by general principle of laws recognized by civilized nations. So you are protected. But the advocates of government's freedom are saying, even with those general principles, right, the inherent power is with the government. They can terminate it anytime. The author is contesting that. The author is saying your argument is flawed. Basically, the author is saying, yes, the author is saying they do not have that inherent power. The governments of these developing countries do not have inherent power to terminate the contract anytime. And now, if I show you the rest of the passage, right, there is a first in second paragraph, and there is a second in the third paragraph. Okay, I'll just clear the screen. So first and second. What do you think is happening in the next two paragraphs? Reasons. So this is, let me say, I'll just write it here, support paragraph 1, and this is support paragraph 2. Yes or no? Just by the looks of it, I understand the structure of the passage. पहले paragraph में है, the author believes the government does not have an inherent power to terminate the contracts anytime they want. And then the author provides two reasons to support that viewpoint. Will it become easy for me if I get that structure, easy for me to navigate this passage? Yes, of course, right? So what we'll do next is I'll give you some time to read these two paragraphs, and these two paragraphs we understand. The author will be providing support for his or her viewpoint that the government does not have those inherent power, right? So read the two paragraphs, and then we'll apply this to a couple of questions that we'll do. Okay, as I said, there will be more questions in this sheet, but I will link this sheet in the description, and you can solve the remaining questions, later. But we'll solve 2 to 3 questions now together. So first, read these two paragraphs.
All right. So let's do this together, okay? So when, the moment I wrote whatever I wrote on top of the screen, did it become easier for you to read the two paragraphs much quickly or to make sense of them better, have a better grip on them, right? Because when I'm reading the paragraphs with some context in my head, I'm able to, read through them quickly because I already know what purpose will they serve, in the context of the passage. So I'm reading the two paragraphs in the sense that they will provide support to the author's view, right? That whatever these advocates were saying, right, that inherent government power is built into these general principles, that is flawed. Basically, the principles, there is no general principle, firstly, and the inherent government powers are not built into these general principles. Just look. First, in French law, not all government contracts are treated as administrative contracts. Remember, in the first paragraph, you know, it said they become special, right? Somewhere here it said that this becomes special class of contracts known as administrative contracts. So the government has built-in power over them, right? And the author contests that in the second paragraph and says, you know what? Not all government contracts are treated as administrative contracts. Some contracts are designed as administrative by specific statute, in which case the contractor is made aware. The contractor is made aware, right? It's not that it is, just built in of the applicable legal laws. Alternatively, the contracting government agency can itself designate a contract as administrative by including certain terms not found in private civil contracts. So they can designate a contract as administrative, special, but then the contractors are made aware of it. It's not the case that all contracts are administrative contracts and therefore the power is built in. So basically showing that it's not a general principle. These are specific cases, specific contracts, right? Moreover, even in the case, so moreover is also an important word. Even in the case of administrative contracts, French law requires that in that event, the government unilaterally modifies the terms of the contract. And read this part. It must compensate the contractor for any increased burden resulting from the government's action, right? So there's no inherent power to terminate anytime on their whims and fancies, right? That's not the case. Even if they are, sort of changing something fundamentally, they will have to compensate the contractor. Essentially, the government is thus prevented from modifying those contractual terms that define the financial balance in the contract. So they don't have unlimited power, right? And neither this is generally applicable, right? They will have to designate contracts as administrative contracts. By default, they are not administrative contracts, right? तो उसमें general वाली बात नहीं है, सारे laws नहीं है. And secondly, the government does not have immense power. They will have to compensate the contractor, right? Then in the second paragraph, there will be another reason. Reason for what? That these are not general laws. These are not general principles that govern all contracts, right? And the government does not have inherent power, right? So look, second, the French law of administrative contracts, although adopted by several countries, it's not universally accepted. So not general, it's not universally accepted. In the case of US and United Kingdom, government contracts are governed by ordinary law. तो देखो यूनिवर्सल एप्लीकेशन नहीं है, right? Indeed, the very fact that termination and modification clauses are commonly found in government contracts suggests that government's capacity to modify or terminate agreements unilaterally derives from specific contract provisions, not from inherent state power. तो दो ही पॉइंट्स थे ना उसके advocates के, that the general principles give inherently provide that power, right, to the government. They have this power to terminate the contract anytime they want. तो ऑथर ने दो पॉइंट्स पे अटैक किया. पहला, एक तो ये general नहीं है, it's not universal, it does not apply to all laws, and secondly, not all countries follow this, and more importantly, the if they have to unilaterally do something, those provisions are specifically mentioned, right? And the contractors are made aware. So it's not a default setting, right? The government does not sort of, as it says, derive that power from, from the law itself. It derives from this power from specific provisions, right? So on two counts, the author dismisses that counter argument by the advocates, right? So we get that, we understand the structure, right? So what we'll do is we will try to solve a couple of questions. So this is the overview, right? This is the overview. We'll just quickly go through this. So what is the author trying to do here? Prove that governments do not have inherent power to modify development agreements. They do not have. And general principles don't give that power to the government. How the paragraphs are set up? Para 1 sets up the debate. The author presents a viewpoint in paragraph 1 that your argument is flawed, declares flawed the argument of advocates. Para 2 give reasons why it is flawed. Para 3 give reason number 2. Simple structure. Where this leading towards concluding that administrative contract theory cannot override investor protections. They have inherent protections, right? So it's not that the general theory is sort of biased towards government. It does not provide government with inherent powers or unlimited powers also, right? Okay, with this overview, just with this overview, right? If I get this structure right, just this, I'll be able to answer many questions. I'll show you. You can yourself do them, right? Let's solve question number 1 first, and you can sort of solve it, and then we can discuss the answer. Question number 1. Right. So in the passage, the author is primarily concerned with doing which one of the following. ठीक है. Pointing out flaws in an argument provided in support of a position. Yeah, he did that, right? Your argument is flawed because of the following reasons. A looks very good. Analyzing the weaknesses inherent in the proposed solution to a problem. Is there a solution to any problem? No. It presents the argument of the advocates of government's power, government's freedom rather, and then the author dismisses that argument. He's not analyzing any weakness, right? And there is no proposed solution also. Wrong. So this is out. Marshalling evidence in support of a new explanation of a phenomenon. New explanation. No such new explanation is there. C is out. Analyzing the risk inherent in adopting a certain course of action. Not adopting a course of action. They believe in some argument, and the author says there are these two flaws in your argument. That's it. They're not adopting a course of action and then the author is pointing out risk. That's not the case. Option A is correct. And you would have done it in, I don't know, 5 seconds, 7 seconds. If you got the passage right, this is 7-second or 10-second question. A is correct, right? Let's see another main idea question. Which one of the following states the author's main conclusion? I'll give you a minute to attempt it, and then I'll give you the answer. Again, this would have come easy. Let's look at the options. Providing that an international agreement governed by general principles of law is not a viable method of guaranteeing legal security of such an agreement. The author never makes that point. All the author is saying, the advocate's argument that government has inherent power, right, because of these general principles, because of this administrative contract theory, the government has inherent power, that's not the case. So A is out. B says French law regarding contracts is significantly different from those in the United States and the United Kingdom. Yeah, that may be the case, but that's not the main point, right? B is out. In order to answer this question, just remember the author is telling the advocates of government's freedom that your argument is flawed. We need a similar sort of statement expressing that viewpoint. Contracts between governments and private investors in most nations are governed by ordinary contract law. That's not the point, right? Again, that's not the point. D, an inherent power of a government to modify or terminate a contract cannot be considered a general principle of law. Yes, it's not a general principle of law. If the government needs to do that, they will have to write down those specific provisions into the agreement, and the contractors will be made aware of that. It's not inherent, and it's not sort of general. It's not a general principle. That's what the point is. D is correct. Again, if you have read the passage carefully, this is a 10-seconder, right? People will be able to solve this under 10 seconds. Let's do one more, and then I'll give you the sheet, and you can solve the remaining questions, and you'll realize you will get many of them correct on your own. Let me see which question we can do. Okay, so some of the questions are based on the bolded statements. So what we'll do is we'll answer a question that is on the whole of the passage, right? Let's do question number 4. Okay, we are doing question number 4. Again, you will not feel the need to go back to the passage as with 1 and 3 that we did. Okay, so the author implies which one of the following is true of economic development agreements? Firstly, the general principle does not accord inherent power on the governments to unilaterally terminate them or modify them, right? It's not a general principle, and it does not give inherent power to the governments, right? With that thought, let's look at the options. They provide greater economic benefits to the governments that are parties to such agreements than to foreign investors? No. If the government unilaterally does anything, if there are specific provisions allowing the government to do that, then the contractors will be compensated, right? if they face any economic or financial loss, right? So that's not the case. In fact, the author is arguing against it. A is out. They are interpreted differently by courts in the United Kingdom than they are by courts in United States. Okay, that may be the case, but no such thing is mentioned in the passage, right? There is this option does not get support from the passage. We are sure of that. They have proliferated in recent years as a result of government's attempts to make them more legally secure. No such point is made. They entail greater risks to investors when the governments that enter into such agreements reserve the right to modify unilaterally the terms of the agreements. Yes, so this option, remember, is not saying they entail great risk. It says greater. Greater is relatively, right? Of course, if the government has that specific provision allowing it to unilaterally change the terms of the agreement, then they are at greater risk, right? We are not saying they have unlimited risk. And yes, there are sort of mechanisms to make the necessary compensation. But yes, the risks are greater if if the government has to unilaterally change or terminate anything. But remember, in the passage we are given, this is not generally applicable. It's not by default. You will have to write specific provisions for this to happen, right? But yes, we can agree with this that they entail greater risk. So fourth is D. All right. So what we'll do is I'll give you the sheet as I said, and you can solve the remaining questions, right? And again, I'll try to emphasize that if you get the passage right, you get the structure, you get the main idea, many of the questions, I will go on to the extent to say most of the questions can be answered in quick time, 5 seconds to 15 to 20 seconds, right? All right. So we will end this here. I hope this sort of, brings you back to the very fundamental of this paper, reading the passage in a way that you understand the main idea, you get the structure, right? Remember, this is the start of everything. This is the basic of solving RC's logical reasoning, legal reasoning passages. Okay. So we'll stop here. And I'll see you in future such sessions. Okay, take care. Happy clatting, everyone. Bye bye.